Now, SharePoint 2013 is awesome, but there are several different products that you can use or must use in conjunction with it that make it even better. There are Office web apps that let you see and or edit documents in the browser. There is a free tool called SharePoint Designer that you can use to work with pages in a Smart Client application. There is a standalone service called Azure Workflow Services that is required for the new style of workflow. There's this thing called InfoPath that you can use to create forms. This other thing called Access that you can also use to create forms. And then finally this command shell called PowerShell that you can use to do all sorts of fun administrative things to your SharePoint farm from the command line instead of through the browser. Now, Office web apps, I think, are a must. This gives you browser-based viewing of Word, PowerPoint, Excel, and OneNote. Now, to install Office web apps, you must have a separate server. You cannot put it anywhere where you have SQL Server or a SharePoint web front end or a SharePoint application server. It wants to live by itself. And once you've got it set up, you connect to it. So you can actually have one Office web app server or group of servers that service multiple SharePoint farms if you want. It is free if you just want to view items. Otherwise, you need to buy some extra licenses in order to be able to edit documents. And one of the coolest things about Office web apps is that it uses an open API called WAPI. And it's very well documented. So if you wanted to create a viewer in Office web apps for some proprietary type of document that you have inside of your organization, or perhaps that you sell as an ISV, you certainly can do that. All right, so we're going to jump over to our server now and take a look at Office web apps in action. Okay, so let's jump over to our document library. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is Office web apps is used to render preview thumbnails that are fully featured. So I have an Excel spreadsheet here called Fruit, and Fruit contains a chart and some data. And if I open up the menu for this, the Excel web app takes a little second to initialize itself. And then it gives us a beautiful representation of the delicious fruit pie chart that I made earlier. These are the jokes, people. And we can open this up. And this is opening in the Office client application, although I could have opened it up in the browser. And you'll see that this has a tab with a chart as well as a tab with data. So there's our chart, and there's our data. With PowerPoint documents, we can actually move through the deck. I chose one that only had one slide in it, so let's switch over to a different one. You can see we actually move through this deck without having to go to any other pages or open anything up. Same thing with Word. And actually scroll through the document, see what's inside of it. Now, Office web apps will allow us to create any of these types of documents in place without having to open up the Office client. And the level of functionality that you get in the browser depends on the application that you're talking about. So of all of them, I think PowerPoint has probably got the best overlap between the web-based version and the web-based version, but all of them are completely useful. It's totally possible to write a nice-looking Word document in Office web apps. The last thing that I want to look at here is OneNote. So I'm going to come over to New Document and choose OneNote Notebook. And we'll call this My Notebook. And I'll choose OK. And this gives me a notebook that I can use to collaborate with lots of other people at the same time. Now, there's no real way for me to simulate this here in the web app because I just have the one user account. But if I had multiple people in here as they edited the document, their stuff would appear along with a little tag that told me who opened it. So I'm going to open this up in OneNote because I can kind of simulate this. And here you can see what I mean. So there's the text I wrote, yes, and it's put the little A to tell me that administrator did that. Even though it's the same account because one is in the browser and the other one is in the desktop, it gives me this information. Of course, I can edit in here as well. And this is a sync operation. So it's not instant. It's going to run in the background. If I come back over here to the web app, you can see that it has already synced it to put no in here. Just a little fun thing that I do because I produce a lot of videos and I use a lot of different machines. I've taken to sort of using the OneNote web app as a distributed clipboard where I move stuff back and forth so that I can get it to the various machines that I'm using. The next complementary product that I want to talk about is SharePoint Designer. And did you know that SharePoint Designer is free? Well, that's a little joke because we always laugh at people that are trying to figure out what to talk about on their blogs, and that was a really common thing that people wrote about when it became free. But did you know that there is controversy surrounding SharePoint Designer? Well, SharePoint Designer is a really popular tool among power users, and for a lot of reasons, one of them being that you can use it to dynamically visually edit list view web parts and provide all sorts of fun formatting. List view web parts in previous versions of SharePoint being based on XSLT. So, it was a good tool that let business users edit XSLT, which is a pretty nasty computer science-y thing. You could also use SharePoint Designer to build and edit master pages. The problem is that in 2013, the visual designers are all gone. So it's still called SharePoint Designer, but there are very few design surfaces in it at all. What they want you to do is use Design Manager for branding publishing sites. And the fact of the matter is list views are now based on JavaScript instead of XSLT, so I guess we'll have to wait to see what it is that they come up with. The traditional XSLT tools still sort of work. But they work on the text in the file. So you can't see what you're doing as you're doing it, and if you make a mistake, you won't know until you preview it in the browser. That said, SharePoint Designer is still extremely useful for workflow development and also for light system administration. All right, so what I'm going to do now is open up SharePoint Designer and show you some of the things that are still in there that are still useful. So here we are back on our team site, and I could open up SharePoint Designer through the Start menu. I've taken to using the little find box. And there's also the ability when you're editing pages to open up the SharePoint Designer straight from the ribbon. But here we have SharePoint Designer looking at my team site. Now, if we look at the site ribbon here, we can see that there is a lot of administrative stuff that we can do. We can create new web part pages and lists, document libraries, and we can create workflows and new sites and rename things. We can save our sites as templates. We can see the recycle bin. We can open up the site settings page, and we can even preview whatever it is that we're looking at right now in the browser. And we can specify different browsers that we want to look at stuff in. One tool that I use a lot is the All Files view. And the All Files view is really handy because it shows you all of the files. Now, this may seem like a silly thing for me to say, but the fact of the matter is there's a lot of stuff in a SharePoint site that could be difficult to get to absent SharePoint Designer. And so this is a very convenient tool if we were interested, for example, in editing. Well, that's a little bit quick on the clicking sometimes. Let's go back to All Files and go to Catalogs and go to Master Page. Oh, I did it again. Darn it. All right, let me use the Enter key instead. So I can drill down into display templates for search, for example, and edit all of these things. Now, this can be done through Design Manager by manipulating the HTML. It could also be done by sharing the file, or rather mapping a folder to SharePoint. But this is a nice and easy and perfectly valid way of going about it. I can also see all of my content types and make new ones. I can make new site columns. I can make new pages and, like I said, new workflows. So there's even a data source designer and the ability to work with external content types if I'm using business connectivity services. So you'll probably hear from people that SharePoint Designer 2013 is a real disappointment because they really miss the visual design surface. However, it is a powerful tool and it should be in your bag of tricks. The next thing I'd like to tell you about is Windows Azure Workflow Services. And what this does is implement the new workflow runtime. In between SharePoint 2010 and SharePoint 2013, SharePoint has moved from the .NET 2.0 framework to the .NET 4.5 framework. And that has a new workflow runtime. Unlike SharePoint 2010 and 2007, this workflow engine is external to SharePoint. You create it on a server and then you connect SharePoint to it. It is required if you want to use new style workflows in SharePoint Designer or via Visual Studio, although most people are going to use SharePoint Designer or perhaps even a third-party tool like Nintex. Now, the old style of workflow is still supported. And there is a backward compatibility there. So it's possible to have workflows in your SharePoint 2013 environment without having Windows Azure Workflow Services installed. You just can't create the new kind of workflows. And as you'll see in a second, they're pretty powerful, and there's a lot of reasons why you'd want to use them. There's also some interop between the new style workflow and the old style workflow. The biggest change, probably, is that these workflows are declarative only. Unlike the previous version of workflow, you cannot create a code-based workflow using Visual Studio. In Visual Studio, you can create declarative workflows. Now, that said, the new style workflows can consume web services, and you can create custom workflow activities which are code-based. But the biggest change in these declarative workflows is that they now support loops, parallel processes, events, and web services, which makes them a pretty good option in many situations that may have caused you to use Visual Studio in the past. All right, so let's take a look at the Workflow Designer in SharePoint Designer. I'm not going to show you how to configure Windows Azure Workflow Services because it's well documented, and once it's configured, it does not have any sort of user interface. So we'll actually take a look at what you get once it's installed. All right, so I'm not going to build a workflow at this point. I just want to show you the designer in the interest of time. So I'm just going to close all of the tabs that I have open, and we are back on the Homepage tab for my site. And you can see here in the ribbon that I have options for workflows that are tied to lists, workflows that are reusable, workflows that are tied to a site. So I'm going to click the list workflow just because, and I'll choose my sales data list, and we'll call this demo. And you can see that there is a drop-down that lets me choose the platform that I want to build on. So if I'm comfortable with the SharePoint 2010 workflow, where there's something that it can do that the 2013 workflow can't do, I can always use that old workflow style. But we're going to use a 2013 workflow in this case. And if you're familiar with SharePoint Designer and the previous workflow engine, this designer is going to look pretty familiar to you. Workflows are divided up into stages, and you have conditions and actions. So a condition is if something is this way, then, and then the then part is the action that you're going to support. But there's some new fun stuff here. So there's a parallel block. And so we can have multiple actions that will run in parallel. There are loops, which can loop a number of times or loop until some condition is met. In terms of actions, we can start some other workflow. And this is a good way to do interoperability. So if you have something that you want to do in this, like collect data from user, which is one of the tasks that is not in this workflow engine directly, you could start a workflow that was based on the old workflow platform if you felt like it. But You can call web services, you can do calculations, you can send emails, you can work with list items, creating them, checking them in, checking them out, even translate documents using the translation service from Microsoft. There's the ability to work with tasks, and then a number of utility options that you can use to manipulate data. You can set your workflows up, if it's a list workflow, to start manually or to run when an item is created or when an item is changed. You can pass in parameters through a thing called an initiation form. You can have local variables. So this is a very full-featured workflow designer tool. It does not have a sort of graphical look inside of SharePoint. However, something I won't show you, but which does exist, is the ability to define workflows in Visio and to go back to Visio. So you can actually create flowcharts of what you want your workflow to do in Visio, bring it into SharePoint Designer, implement the actual behavior, and then maybe export it back out to Visio to show what the current state of the workflow is if you changed it after you brought it in. A lot of people like the Nintex tool as opposed to SharePoint Designer, but one thing that often pushed people to Nintex was that previously there was really no good way to handle loops and parallel processes in SharePoint Designer. So in my opinion, the declarative workflows, which Azure Workflow Services support, are now a much more viable option for custom solutions that are built by people other than power users and that can be used at enterprise scale. The next product that I want to talk about is part of Office, and it's called InfoPath. And in my opinion, InfoPath is a dead product. Microsoft does not say it's dead. I've seen them give lip service to InfoPath to say that it is still valid. However, even though it's not official, there was a grand total of 1 InfoPath talk at the recent SharePoint conference. And there have been no advances of note in InfoPath since 2010. So in 2010, InfoPath folks were a little bit disappointed because InfoPath did not support managed metadata columns, which are central to so much of SharePoint 2013 and were important in 2010. Well, guess what? InfoPath still does not support managed metadata columns. InfoPath is based on Xforms, which is a dead standard. The standards committee behind it no longer exists. It is not advancing. So my personal opinion is you should not make major investments in building stuff with InfoPath or take a lot of time to learn InfoPath. The good news is that there is still and is a well-advanced way that you can make custom business forms, and that is with Microsoft Access. So these are called Access Web Apps, and there was such a thing in 2010. It got some traction and people liked it, but it had some limitations in terms of how it was implemented. And so it has been redone as a new service application called Access Services 2013. If you have old Access Services apps, you can have the 2010 style right alongside the 2013 style in the same farm. And this can replace InfoPath in many instances because it will let you build forms and have some macro capabilities and store the data in much the same way that InfoPath would. Let's jump over to our SharePoint server and actually take a look at an Access web app that I've created previously so you can see what it's all about. Now, before I show you this, in interest of full disclosure, there is additional setup that is required to get Access services to run, just like there is with the Azure Workflow Services. So there are some SQL Server components that you might not have installed in a stock SharePoint 2013 installation that you're going to need to install. You're going to need to configure another service application called Secure Store and do a few other steps in order to make everything work. But once you have it all configured, then you will have the ability to create new Access web apps. I've created one here already called Issue Tracking, which is based on an issue tracking template. So if I open this up, you can see that here in the browser, I have a new app. So this is a type of SharePoint app, and it created an app web for me, just like you might have if you created a Napa app. And I have an issues table with a form that goes along with it. And there's one for my customers, and a few different views of it. I can look at it in datasheet view. I can see it with a search box, and it can also track employees. Now, say that I am not fully satisfied with this. I can open up Access and connect to it, or I can choose Customize and Access and open this up. So I'm going to say OK. And here is my app in Microsoft Access. So you can see I have a number of tables, I have a number of forms, and I have an editing experience. Get this splitter to work over. That is very comfortable. So I can format controls, I can place them on the form, move stuff around just like I could if I was using InfoPath, except in this case I'm actually getting the benefit of SQL Server, which can do the manipulation of my objects for me. So I can create tables and queries and all sorts of fun stuff that you may be familiar with Access. There's also a macro capability that we can use to cause simple operations to take place based on the installation of the app, a user's activity, things that happen when data changes. So what I'm going to do here is I've taken a look at the out-of-the-box starter kit for it, and I've decided, whenever I have issues with my customers, I also have an opportunity to build a better relationship with that customer. So I can make a new table, and it tries to be really helpful. In other words, it's got a bunch of starter templates that are available in terms of tables. None of them start with W, but whoops, let's restart that because I just crashed it. So I was in the process of adding a new table. But this has a variety of different starter tables that I can choose from. But in this case, I'm just going to create a new blank table. And this is going to be opportunity. So I'm related to customers, right? Because customer has an issue, then I need to figure out how I'm going to turn that into something that's beneficial for both parties. So I'm going to look up from another table or query, which is going to be customers. And when I do this, it's going to create a relationship between the two tables. And we'll just make a text field called opportunity. And we'll make this long text just so we can give it a definition. So I'm going to save this table. And so now when I come back over here to issue tracking, you can see that it has added an opportunities area for me. And then for the issue itself, we have customer and opportunity. So if I save this and go back to the app, then I now have an opportunity form that goes along with the opportunity. And I could continue to work on this to put this into tabs within existing forms. But hopefully this gives you a taste of what Access Services is all about. I think it's a very, very promising technology, and I encourage you to check it out. The last complementary product that I want to talk about is PowerShell. When you install SharePoint 2013, you also install Windows PowerShell 3.0. And what this is a command shell that you can use to perform all sorts of operations from the command line. It also has a very powerful scripting language that's available to it. PowerShell was included along with SharePoint 2010, which was PowerShell 2.0, and it uses a SharePoint snap-in. Now, the problem that a lot of us had with PowerShell 2.0 and SharePoint was that we were already familiar with this tool called STS-ADM, which is a command line tool that does all sorts of fun operations on SharePoint. And, PowerShell had a slightly different syntax and, could be quite a bit more intimidating to use. Well, it's fairly safe to say that has changed in PowerShell 3.0 because PowerShell 3.0 has a new editor or an improved editor called PowerShell ICE, which is the integrated scripting environment. And PowerShell ICE, along with the command builder and the help system, goes a long way toward making it possible to do SharePoint administration without having to learn a dozen commands or more just to get started. All right, so let's take a look at PowerShell ICE on our SharePoint 2013 server, and I will show you how much easier it is compared to the previous version. All right, so I'm going to open up under the SharePoint 2013 products. There is a link for SharePoint 2013 Management Shell. And when I open this, this opens up PowerShell and the SharePoint snap-in. Now there's a command I can use to see what the snap-ins are, and it's get PS snap-in. And what I'm doing, you can't see my hands, but I'm hitting the tab key. And that is actually moving me through the things that started with get-ps. And I can see here that one of the PowerShell snap-ins that are running is Microsoft SharePoint PowerShell. So what I want to do is be able to use the integrated scripting environment, but to be able to script against SharePoint. I've already set this up on this machine. I'm going to open up PowerShell ICE now. And inside PowerShell ICE, I'm going to execute the get PS snap-in command again. And you can see that it's got Microsoft SharePoint PowerShell installed. And the way I did that was I added the command to load the snap-in in a file called a profile, which executes whenever I open up this tool. So I'm going to do that now just to show you what that file looks like. I'm going to execute psedit, which is the command that opens the PowerShell editor, and I'm going to start typing, and this is another thing that you can see that it does, is that it has IntelliSense. So I'm going to say profile dot, and I'm going to look for all users for the current host being PowerShell ICE. And here's the command that I'm executing. So I could actually open up any PowerShell window that did not have the SharePoint stuff installed and call add ps snap-in microsoft.sharepoint.powershell, and I would then have access to the commands in the PowerShell environment that I opened up. Now, one of the cool things about this is that it's got this command builder, which can also be opened from the command line. You don't have to have ICE for this, but I find the IntelliSense in ICE to be really handy. So if you have ever done SharePoint administration or programming against SharePoint, you won't be surprised to hear that a lot of the commands have SP in them. And so if I type -SP, which is just a little search box up here in the name, I can see all of these, and as you can see, there's a lot of them, PowerShell commands that will let me do all sorts of things to my SharePoint environment. So it's possible, if you're savvy with PowerShell, that you could work with a SharePoint environment without having the desktop experience installed or without using SharePoint Central Administration. But it will also give you quite a bit of help. So if we type -SP web, we can see, here's a command called export SP web. And if we click on it, then we get this window that shows us all of the parameters that this command takes, as well as a little help link that we can click, which opens up the help for that particular command and its parameters. Now, the help commands have a lot of capability. That was kind of a shortened version of it. But from the command line, we could say get help, and this is get SP web, SPW, and you can see it completes itself for me. And this gives us the same sort of information, and we can even see examples. Now, this is up to the creator of the actual commandlet to provide this, so not every commandlet has examples, but most of them do. After I've installed all of this stuff, I can also, from time to time, keep my help files updated by using the update help command. And when I run this, it will go out to the internet and attempt to download all of the help files related to whatever PowerShell snap-ins and modules that I happen to have in my current session. And there it goes. You can see that it's updating the help for all of the different things that I've got. And so I do this periodically to make sure that I have the latest and greatest. But this is just barely scratching the surface of PowerShell itself. However, the key thing that I want you to keep in mind is that this is a lot easier to use than STS admin because it gives you a lot more help in terms of the command builder and the help that you can download, and IntelliSense and auto completion. So if you haven't taken the time to jump into PowerShell and you're an administrator or a developer for that matter, I highly encourage you to do so.